There's a few passages, statements in the New Testament that have puzzled scholars, theologians for centuries, and I really think we can make a good case that the puzzle is solved by the shroud in a few of these puzzling texts. And so we're going to be looking particularly at the book of Hebrews, but that's just one of a few that are of that nature.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes and podcasts. As you know, I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today we have Larry Stalley on the line, and he is one of the Bible experts, biblical scholars, and of course, he is an awesome shroud researcher. And we're going to be talking about his upcoming book. And let me introduce it now, but with the title, and then I'll let Larry take over and go from there. So his new book is called The Veiled Witness, which is how the shroud was understood by the first Christians. And that is an incredible time period, as Christianity in the first century, the second and the third century was trying to come together. The Trinity wasn't really developed yet, and all of the things that we understand today were still in their formative period. So Larry, welcome. So good to have you.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Oh, Guy, it's so good to be back with you. Thank you for the invite. I think we have something really intriguing today to discuss. In the Shroud studies, we so often talk about the authenticity of the Shroud, but we want to go beyond that, and we want to try to discern just how the early Christians understood this image and this burial cloth. And I think there's quite a bit out there that we can bring to the surface from the biblical texts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so good to have a biblical scholar like yourself on, so that, when it just amazes me. You take a text and you really dig into each word and the grammar and everything else on it. And then to really make sure that we're truly understanding exactly what's in those words and in the verses and in the context, and then how the words were used in the past. So it's not just what's going on in that sentence, but how that word has been defined, in previous writings in the first century, or even other writings going back into the Old Testament.
Yeah, yes, Guy, there's a few passages, statements in the New Testament that have puzzled scholars, theologians for centuries, and I really think we can make a good case that the puzzle is solved by the shroud in a few of these puzzling texts. And so we're going to be looking particularly at the book of Hebrews, but that's just one of a few that are of that nature.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you sent me 2 chapters, I guess, from your new book, chapter 4 and 5, which I guess specifically relate to the shroud and a couple of things. And I was fascinated by a couple of them. And of course, you have some quotes from verses from Hebrews, but there was also Corinthians and Colossians. So I don't know. Why don't I let you take over and bring up your presentation, and we can go from there.
Okay, very good. There came to be in the church what was known as the discipline of the secret. Now that term did not really come about until the 17th century with a Calvinist writer, but that principle goes all the way back, I think, to the first century, and we even find it in the book of Hebrews. This discipline to keep certain matters about the faith, certain important mysteries of the faith, particularly regarding the Eucharist and baptism, that's where it really surfaced, is kept from those who have not been initiated into the church. And I believe the shroud is at the heart of this discipline of the secret as it came to be known. We can go right back to the words of Jesus, where he warned his followers not to give that which is holy to the dogs, not to throw their pearls before swine. And we might ask, well, what would have been more holy? What would have been holier than the burial shroud of our Lord stained with his precious redeeming blood? And so I think it's worth considering that perhaps that's one way they understood this imperative, not to throw what is holy before the dogs. And in the book of Hebrews, it talks about milk that's given to the infants, but solid food is for the mature. And we do read in the early church documents, Tertullian, for example, Origen, talking about certain instruction being reserved until after the initiate is baptized, or that certain matters regarding the Eucharist were kept from those who had not gone through a catechism and had not been initiated into the faith. And so that's the sort of thoughts that we want to talk about. When I've studied this subject of the shroud in the early church, the writings of the Bible and the early patristic writers, if we want to understand how the early Christians understood the shroud, then we need to do it through the lens of biblical typology and tabernacle theology. Jesus himself gave a perfect example about lifting up the serpent in the wilderness. We're told in the Gospel of Luke that after the resurrection, Jesus told his disciples that he began to point to passages and statements in the Old Testament. He says, these were fulfilled in me. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And this is very important, this typology, that everything in the Old Covenant is pointing towards Christ and his ministry. And in the Gospel of John, we have this example from Jesus himself, where Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And I think this actually pertains to the shroud, and I think it here's how he states it. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And so this serpent in the wilderness was due to them cursing the manna that God had given them. And we're going to see that the manna is one of the antitypes that prefigured or foreshadowed the shroud and how it's a type. So the idea of typology and the shroud in the book of Hebrews is where we'll be camping, I think, most of the current hour. I believe that in the book of Hebrews, we can find several antitypes. Now, anti with an E, not an I. That is, before the shroud, there were these shadows and these copies of it earlier, particularly regarding the tabernacle in the wilderness. And in the book of Hebrews, one of the puzzling passages that scholars do not have a consensus regarding is the greater tent that's mentioned in chapter 9, verse 11. That's a crucial part of our study today. It says, when Jesus Christ appeared as a high priest through the greater and more perfect tent. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what was this tent? There's also the curtain of the tabernacle, the priestly vestment. The shroud is the ark of the new covenant. It hides, you might say, the golden jar of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. All three of these objects that were kept within the ark were antitypes. They foreshadowed the shroud, and we're going to look at how that, what was intended and meant by that, and also the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, in the book of Hebrews, we have a grand chiasmus. A chiasmus is a literary or rhetorical structure where the second half parallels the first half, certain statements, but they're in reverse order. And often the key point of the chiasmus is at the center. So we have here this grand chiasmus going over several chapters, from chapter 6 to chapter 10, where the focus is on the curtain of the tabernacle and this more true tabernacle, this greater, more perfect tabernacle. Chapter 6, a hope which enters within the curtain where Jesus has entered. B, the true tent which the Lord pitched, not man. And then B prime, Christ passed through that greater and more perfect tent, and through his own blood he entered the Holy of Holies. And then A prime, we have confidence to enter the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way which was opened for us through the curtain, that is, by means of his flesh. So these are very critical statements to the whole structure of what he's talking about in these chapters. And it deals with the shroud. Particularly this one right in the center. Christ passed through the greater and more perfect tent. Now, tabernacle is simply the English word we use for the Greek skene, which means a tent. And a tabernacle is a sacred tent. James Swetnam, who was he got his PhD at Oxford, focused on the book of Hebrews. And he taught for, I think it was 50 years at the Vatican there in Rome, at the Pontifical Academy there, and a very prestigious scholar, and again, an expert in the book of Hebrews, got his doctorate on this. And he says concerning this greater, more perfect tent of chapter 9, verse 11, he says, the identity of the tent has been a constant puzzle to exegetes past and present. It's a tent well known to the addressees of the epistle. So the readers of Hebrews understood, in the opinion here of Dr. Swetnam, they understood what the writer was talking about, this greater, more perfect tent, or sacred tent, tabernacle. And yet there's no consensus. The early patristics, many of them thought it was the body of Christ, this greater, more perfect tent. Some thought it was the church, but there's no consensus as to what that was. I believe it was the shroud. It's interesting. We go back to this serpent in the wilderness in John chapter 6, where Jesus talked about him being the manna, the food sent from heaven, the nourishment. He says, for this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him will have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. I think that's a very interesting text when you consider the typology he mentioned in chapter 3 about the serpent. Because in the story of the serpent, if you cast your eyes on that molten serpent, then the poisonous snake, the poison didn't have any effect. You were saved from that bite. Now, what's important for us to understand here is that in chapter 9, in verse 4, well, he opens a chapter and he talks about how there was an earthly tabernacle, an earthly tent in the wilderness. And verse 2, he says there was first this compartment called the holy place that the priest would enter into. And then in verse 3, chapter 9, there he says, and then there was you go through the curtain, and there's the second compartment, the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred piece of furniture, because this is where the blood of atonement on the day of Yom Kippur, the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled on the mercy seat, on this golden chest. And this represented the presence of God with the golden cherubim there, guarding the throne, God's throne in his presence. And inside that box were three objects. There was the jar of manna, there was the tablets of the law, and there was Aaron's rod that budded. And I want to show how each of those were antitypes of the shroud. That is, they foreshadowed, they found their fulfillment in the burial cloth of Christ. They They looked forward to it. And Guy, you stop me anytime now you want to. But let's first talk about then the rod of Aaron. Now, each of these objects in the golden ark, the chest, the box, were referred to as witnesses. They were witnesses of God's covenant with the Israelites. They were also a witness of how they broke the covenant. And so if we think of the rod of Aaron, the story behind it budding is a rebellion of Korah and Dathan and Nathan. And they rose up against the authority of Aaron as the high priest and Moses, who made you ruler over us? And God sent and they cursed the manna too. That was back in chapter 17 with the serpent. But yeah. So what happened with the rod? After a number were struck dead, and Aaron offered up incense to stop the plague, the Lord gave instruction. He said, "Tell Aaron through Moses. Tell Aaron, each of the tribal princes." To bring their walking stick. So 12 tribes, they bring the 12 walking sticks, and they put it in the tabernacle overnight. And then to their amazement, in the morning, Aaron's rod has budded. It's got blossoms, and it's even got almonds on it. So there's a new life, a sign of new life has come about, a miraculous sign. And that was God vindicating Aaron as his chosen high priest. Now, I think it's fascinating then as you read Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11. It says that Christ, when he appeared as a high priest, when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he passed through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation. And if we think of Aaron's rod, it's quite beyond, I think, just coincidence that there's these parallels that the rod vindicated the high priesthood of Aaron, and it was discovered in the morning, to everybody's surprise, signs of new life. And so the burial shroud like this is found in the morning in the tomb. And we're going to see how the tomb becomes an earthly type of the tabernacle. And the shroud is the holy place, and the tomb is the holy of holies. And so the burial shroud, like the rod, is discovered after it's been in the tabernacle, in the shroud overnight. It's discovered in the morning to have this sign of rebirth, this miraculous image of Christ crucified on it. And it becomes a vindication of Christ's priesthood. He's the high priest here. He passes through the greater, more perfect tent. And it's mentioned there in the context of one of the objects in the covenant, in the box, is this rod. So that's
that's a very interesting simile between the Aaron's rod and the rebirth of Aaron's rod, and then the cloth being although the cloth is not reborn, but the cloth shows the image of the rebirths and the resurrection then of Jesus. That's a very interesting simile.
One of the statements, too, that's said in this text, back in Numbers chapter 21, Moses and Aaron, they're charged to keep this rod of Aaron in the Ark of the Covenant, keep that as a sign, as a witness against the rebels. And I think that's quite interesting. Keep this as a sign against the rebels for future generations, that they can remember what happened. This is a witness of that rebellion, how they rejected the high priesthood of Aaron. And so today, the shroud is a vindication of Jesus's high priesthood, according to the book of Hebrews. and it has been kept all these years by God's providence. So I think that's pretty interesting to me. The typology, that's what I'm trying to explain. The typology between the rod of Aaron and the burial cloth of Christ is just it's just I think providential. It's amazing, quite
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it certainly is, and it always amazes me. And I'm a fan of Isaiah primarily, and but it's amazing as well when you're now talking about Hebrews, and then what Aaron, and then what was in the Ark of the Covenant, and then how that now relates to the future of the covenant with Jesus Christ being fulfilled.
Exactly. So regarding this particular typology about the rod of Aaron, both Aaron and Christ served as the Lord's chosen high priest, and it's the rod and it's the burial shroud that affirms them being a high priest, God's chosen high priest, who were rejected. His high priesthood was rejected by the Jews, and Aaron's high priesthood, was rejected by the Israelites. And it's the rod that vindicates that, and it's the shroud that vindicates it in the book of Hebrews, when he appeared as a high priest. And then both the rod and the shroud spent the night inside the tabernacle, that is, the shroud being the holy place, and we'll talk about that. In each case, a surprising and miraculous sign of rebirth was found in the morning. Almonds on the rod and a miraculous image on the shroud. The discovery constituted a divine witness, a divine testimony, bearing witness to God's chosen high priest. Each object became an abiding witness for future generations. Each was spoken of as being a sign. We have the sign of Jonah in particular, and that was a judicial witness against that evil and wicked generation of the shroud being the sign of Jonah. Each served as a sign from heaven. Each offered miraculous evidence for the engendering, the birthing, strengthening of faith. Each object served as a witness against the rebels. So I think that's really just quite phenomenal, the typology, the parallel between Aaron's rod that budded and Christ's burial shroud that budded a miraculous image. It's,
Yeah.
I think, quite amazing. So here's a
Well, and I
picture
guess
of,
if I
go ahead.
can interrupt you there a second, it's also interesting that the Aaron's rod would have been held in the Ark of the Covenant, and then the shroud would have been held in secret, maybe for different reasons, but nevertheless, kind of both of them were then, held for because they were, miraculously created, so not made by hands, and then they were kept those so that they would be available for all eternity, hopefully.
Yeah, you made a good point too. They both are hidden. The ark hid the rod, and the early church was very careful and guarded about this. There's a number of reasons that we could raise, plausible reasons why the shroud was in the discipline of the secret. It was hidden from outsiders, you might say. I mean, there may be some examples. There may have been times, certainly, where it was used in an evangelistic sense, but among the Jews, you had to be very careful. It could have been easily misunderstood as a graven image. The Jews were very much against images of men, making an image of a man. And even today, many will say, well, the shroud can't be important. It can't be genuine because it'd be an idol. It'd be idolatry. It'd be a graven image. And yet that second commandment says, thou shalt not make a graven image. Well, we don't believe that this image was made by man. It was made by God. And this is actually, this greater, more sacred tent in verse 11 is described. There's two explanations, two clauses that are given to explain it. And the first is not made by human hands. And I would suggest he's not talking there about the composition of the linen. He's talking about the image not made by human hands, the poeta that's used later on an image not made by hands. And this is how the tablets of the law, I would suggest, one of those three objects kept in the Ark of the Covenant, the stone. Well, the stone's not miraculous, but the writing on it was. The inscription, it explicitly states back in the book of Exodus that this is the work of God. It was by the finger of God that the Ten Commandments was written. And I would suggest that's how the shroud becomes a type of those tablets in the context. It's in the context of the passage. And so not only is it Aaron's rod that budded a miraculous image and vindicated the high priesthood of God's, of Aaron and Christ both, but now the tablets of stone, the tablets of the law, engraved by a divine writing, I believe is what is intended by this explanatory clause in verse 11, where it says not made by human hands. Just like the inscription on the stones was a divine inscription, so this image on the shroud is a miraculous inscription. It's not made by human hands. So there's the parallel of the second object in the Ark of the Covenant.
If I could bring up one other thing as well, which you kind of mentioned, and that was, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it, is the discipline of the secret. I wonder if that was kind of the beginning of the Gnostics and Gnosticism, where there were certain things, not only the shroud being potentially kept secret under the discipline of the secret, but also, as you mentioned, the Eucharist and a couple of other things that were kept secret for only those that are well versed and have been accepted into the church, where they then allowed to see these ceremonies and these actions. And wondering if you thought that might be one of the reasons why Gnosticism became so strong at one point.
I think that's a very perceptive question, a very good question. I've wondered if the statement in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, who is the image of the invisible God. And scholars think that phrase is part of an ancient Christian hymn or an ancient creed. Who is the image, Christ, who is the image or the icon, the Greek word icon, who is the icon of the invisible God. And so, yeah, the Gnostics doubted that Christ could ever take on flesh. And so, maybe we see now dimly, maybe this image on the shroud is so faint. It's like an invisible God. It wasn't fully flesh, and yet I think John uses it, the blood and the water, the spear stain, to show, yeah, he is fully flesh. He was crucified and he had blood just like you and I. Because the gods in Greek mythology, they didn't have blood like humans. It was a different kind of blood, that ethereal blood, that if you touched it as a human, it would kill you. But you go back to the discipline of the secret. I might mention a couple other reasons. Not only, I think, was there the plausible reason for secrecy due to it being these Christians being charged with idolatry, a graven image. There's other reasons could be brought up as well. Of course, persecution. They had to guard against. They wanted to keep it safe, and the early Christians were persecuted. But burial cloths were considered unclean, so there would have been charges maybe of impurity. The early Christians, I believe, did not see it as unclean because it was the precious redeeming blood of Christ, and that made it sacred. And so it wasn't unclean; it was a sacred blood. And it belonged to the Lord. And there's other reasons. We'll talk about his vestments, it being holy. The authorities would have wanted to suppress anything that might suggest the resurrection, and would go against their narrative that the disciples had stolen the body, that he never did, never was resurrected. There was also the Greek, the scandal of the cross. where, crucifixion was something very shameful. And so just showing the image on the shroud would create problems to those who had not been initiated into the faith and understood the meaning of it and the theology behind it.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of funny too when you think about it. And I don't want to get off because I know you've got some other really good stuff. But it's interesting as then the discipline of the secret and the persecution that took place, and finally then with Constantine and in 313 and the Edict of Milan, that Christianity was now allowed. And then, and then there's actually what I believe to be some of the first drawings or images that were copied from the shroud, beginning at towards the end of that fourth setting. So, it's that whole sequence of things taking place are kind of they line up with this discipline of the secret and the protection of the shroud and keeping it hidden. So, anyway, I don't let me let you get back to your
Yeah.
narrative here.
Yeah, those are very good comments. Now, this is the focal point of that grand chiasm, as we said, from chapter 6 through chapter 10. B prime is these two verses here, Hebrews 9, 11, and 12. This is the focal point. In fact, you read many of the commentaries, many scholars would say this is the heart of Hebrews. This gets to the heart of the whole theology about him having the greater sacrifice that brought about the redemption of mankind. And so these two verses are very significant. When Christ appeared as a high priest, he passed through the greater and more perfect tent or tabernacle. This word tent is used by the writer for the tents that the patriarchs dwelt in, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just a normal tent. It's also used for the grand superstructure of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And then he uses it for each of the two rooms, the two compartments within the tabernacle, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And so it's used in each of those ways. And we'll talk just a basic meaning here in a minute about the tent. But he passed through the greater, more perfect tent with his own blood. He entered the Holy of Holies, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Now, what's I think quite fascinating is that these two verses also form a chiasmus. We have here a passage that has been very carefully, very skillfully constructed. When Christ appeared as a high priest through the greater tent, and then these two explanatory clauses, not made by human hands, that is, not of this creation, and not with the blood of goats, he entered, but with his own blood. He entered the heavenly sanctuary, obtaining eternal redemption. Now, I point this slide out because I think it's quite interesting in the chiasmus how tent and blood line up. And of course, we have blood on the shroud. And I maintain that this greater tent is the shroud. That's my thesis. And there's key concepts regarding this typology of the greater tent. I mentioned here how a tabernacle is a tent. It's a sacred tent. And there's a dual function of a tent. A tent, you go camping, it serves two functions. You erect your tent, and it serves as a covering and a place of abode, temporary residence. That's what a tent does. And that's what the tabernacle in the wilderness, it was mobile. They would erect it and then break it down if they broke camp and set it back up. It was a mobile sanctuary, a holy sacred tent. And it had two compartments. And I would suggest the first compartment that he begins in chapter 3, and it is the antitype of the shroud, that the shroud served our Lord as his covering and his place of abode, his residence for 3 days while he was in the tomb. And so in that sense, it could be spoken of as a tent, the greater, more sacred tent. And there's two compartments in the grand superstructure. There's the holy place, the Holy of Holies, separated by the curtain. And what a person needs to understand as we go through this is that in order to get to the second compartment, you've got to go through the curtain. And that's what separates the holy place from the most holy place. And only one person goes through that curtain, and that's only once a year. That's the high priest on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in special white garments. And so we'll talk about that. Now, here's the keys, I think, for understanding what this greater, more perfect tent is. First of all, it's a sacred covering. It's a place of dwelling. It was something not made by human hands. I believe that's in reference to the image. It was associated with Christ's blood. And it speaks of his flesh having passed through. That's very interesting. In chapter 10, he speaks of the curtain which his body went through. And that's what scientists think actually happened in the creation, the formation of the image, is that it became materially transparent and went through the cloth in a strong radiated field of energy coming forth from the body, it would seem. And that radiated image, that energy imprinted the three-dimensional image onto the cloth. I think it was John Jackson who said, that's the only way you're really going to get that three-dimensional effect is if the body somehow dematerialized and went through it. And this is exactly what the text is saying, that Christ passed through the tent.
The actual words in the original Greek then are passed through. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, so this is very interesting too. There is no verb. There is the preposition through. So when you read your English translation, if it says he entered, the New American Standard Version will say enter, and that's very confusing because that's the verb that's used in verse 12, and it confuses the tent with the sanctuary. So if you have the preposition through, you need to supply the verb. Okay? And most of your English translations will take this locative understanding of the preposition, a location, a place. And so in most of your English translations, what you'll have is in italics, probably in italics, past, went, maybe it'll be went, he went through the tent. And it's usually in italics to show that the editor has supplied that verb. Okay? But I'm gonna explain why this is so skillfully, marvelously constructed, because when you don't use the verb, the preposition can be understood in an instrumental sense as with. And you would translate it, this is that Jesus Christ, when he appeared as a high priest with the greater, more perfect tent. And that's how the patristic, the early church fathers, they normally understood it in an instrumental sense. Okay? That's not normally the way it's understood today. I think it's both. And I think that's why it's so skillfully and marvelously constructed and it's crafted. It's crafted intentionally where you can understand it in more than one way, and both are true. So if we take it as the normal locative, it's a place. It's the place of the holy place, the first compartment of the grand superstructure. And the reason that you can see that easily is verse 2, setting this passage up as the antitype, the tent of the wilderness. Verse 2, he speaks of the holy place. And in verse 3, he speaks of the most holy place. Then when he comes to the fulfillment of it in the ministry of Christ, in verses 11 and 12, you've first got the holy place as the tent. That's verse 11. And then verse 12, you've got the sanctuary as the most holy place, the heavenly sanctuary. Once Christ passed through the tent or the curtain, he enters into the Holy of Holies. He enters into heaven. And we'll talk about that. In Hellenistic Judaism of the first century, particularly Philo, down in Alexandria, Egypt, The curtain was thought of as like a magic curtain. It's where the earthly material was separated from the non-material heavenly realm. When you went through the curtain, you entered heaven. That's what Philo taught. And when Christ, in John's Gospel, chapter 1, I think it's verse 14, 12 or 14, it says, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, dwelt among us. The word is tabernacle, the verb. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. John there is tying into tabernacle theology. He is saying that when Christ came to earth in the incarnation and took on flesh, he passed through the heavenly curtain. He left the immaterial realm in heaven, and he came through the curtain and he took on flesh. Now, in the tabernacle, you have just the opposite. In the resurrection, just the opposite happened. He went from flesh through the curtain, through the shroud, and he became immaterial into heaven. And it's interesting in the Gospel of John, at the end, right after the resurrection, that evening he's going through locked doors immaterially, and that's part of our key for understanding what they're thinking there. That he passed through the shroud. They understood he passed through. When it says in John chapter 20, verse 8, he saw and believed. What he saw, the writer teases you. If you know about the shroud and the image, as some of them did back then, his readers, they're thinking, oh, yeah, he saw the image. But no, he didn't see the image because the image was inside. So there's no object to the verb. He saw. What did he see? Well, what John is saying from how he sets the whole passage up is they saw the burial cloths, the orthonia, still wrapped, but there's no body inside. And John understood somehow the body is no longer there, but nobody's unwrapped the burial cloths. One long linen sheet, but then a strip that's wound a few times, and maybe that side strip that's been sewn onto the Shroud of Turin, used to wrap the body in the shroud. And that's what he sees. It's still wrapped. And I have a paper on defending that thesis. But the idea of the shroud being the curtain ties right in with first century Hellenistic Judaism and the teachings of Philo, that this curtain was something not of this creation. It took you into the heavenly realm. When the high priest went through the curtain into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, he was entering into the presence of God. He'd entered heaven. And he was to remove his garments and leave them there in the tabernacle. They were no longer worthy to enter into the earthly realm. They were heavenly garments. And so there's several keys here, I think, to understanding this greater, more perfect tent. If we continue on here in the PowerPoint.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing there. I hadn't thought about it as in detail like you have, where John, when he sees and believes, I always thought he had seen the cloths. He had seen probably the wrapped cloth. So he saw the strip around the shroud cloth, and then but at that moment, then at least based on what we understand from that gospel, is that he did not see the image. The image was not available to be seen because it's on the inside of that wrapped cloth, not on the outside of the wrapped cloth.
Yes, and I believe the reason he doesn't give an object to what he saw is to tease the reader. The one who knows about the shroud, he's being teased, okay? And a couple of reasons in defense of what I've am asserting here is that in the story of Lazarus, chapter 11, we're told that he was bound, and Jesus says, unbind him. There's the charia. There's the wrappings, different from the orthenia. When you come to chapter 19 and 20, the orthenia there includes the chorea. The reader should understand that whereas Lazarus had to be unbound, that never happened to Jesus. He miraculously went through the shroud. See, that's part of the what the reader needs to understand is Lazarus has set us up that in traditional Jewish burials, he's been wrapped with a chorea. That's part of the orthenia, part of the burial cross, not just the linen shroud, but the chorea that Lazarus had been wrapped with. And then you've got the verbiage at the end of chapter 19. It says that he's put in a tomb that nobody has ever been laid before. Now, and then it uses 4 times in chapter 20 how they see the linens lying. That verb lying is 4 times there. Now, in order for something to be lying, it first has to be put in place, set in place. It has to be laid. Okay? So we're told back in chapter 19, there's a verb there. There's never been laid. Now, what happens is what they see lying, it's lying just as it had been laid. You see, nothing has been unwrapped, which happened to Lazarus. So if you follow the verbiage, and then you follow the siderium that's been set aside, it's in a perfect tense. It's folded just as it was at the time of the burial proceedings on Friday evening. Nobody's come in and stolen the body. No one's come in and messed with the burial clothes. They're not lying on the ground like one of the translations say. No, they're actually on the Ark of the Covenant. They're actually on the mercy seat, which is the bench in the tomb. We're gonna talk about that, the typology. So he saw and believed. What in my opinion, my conclusion, and I've written a paper on it, several reasons, but what he sees is the linen cloth as they had been laid, still lying, and nobody's done anything to it, but there's no body inside. So how can a body get out when it's still wrapped? And that led him to believe in the resurrection. You see? And it's the same type of thing later in the chapter where the doors are locked and suddenly he appears. That the Lord is now able to disintegrate, to go through walls, go through his burial shroud. That's what happened. There's enough clues there that I think that's a plausible conclusion.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. So we'll go back to this, finish this. These are keys to understanding that greater, more perfect tent at verse 11. Very important part of this heart of Hebrews, the heart of his theology, and Jesus now appearing as a high priest. This tent, as James Swetnam, the scholar, PhD in Hebrews, 50 years teacher there at the Vatican, one time I think he was professor emeritus and was dean of the faculty, I think, at one time. So a very prestigious scholar. But he said how it was known to the recipients, probably known to the recipients. His writers understood what that greater, more perfect tent was. But he says in verse 5, but of these things we cannot now speak in detail. I think that's the earliest reference or clue we have to what became the discipline of the secret. That the writer mentions these 3 objects kept in the Ark of the Covenant, but says, well, we can't really talk in any detail about them. We can't talk about how the shroud is the fulfillment of each of these, as we've shown the rod and the tablets of the law, and then the jar of manna, which leads to the serpent lifted up in the wilderness, and anyone who would look upon him would be saved. There's all this typology in these 3 objects, as well as the manna becoming the nourishment of the Eucharist eventually. There's all this typology here in this passage, and he says, of these things we cannot now speak in detail. And I'm thinking, well, what I'm trying to say today is if we could flush that out, what would he say? And I'm thinking it's along the lines of this lesson. It's about more than anything, it's about the shroud, the tent, the covering and place of abode of Christ in the tomb was in his shroud, served as a tent. And what's interesting too, Guy, is that in the Gospel of Matthew, at the end of, I think it's chapter 14, you've got this young man, many think he's John Mark, who flees the arrest of Jesus, them clinging onto his linen garment. Remember, he just has a linen garment on. And the soldiers take a hold of him, and he's able to run naked in the night, and they're grasping the linen sheet as he runs off. Well, what's interesting is the word that's used there for that linen is sidon. It's the same word that the Synoptic Gospels use for the shroud, which is a very expensive cloth. And in Judaism, it's linen, particularly when it's connected with the tabernacle and the priestly vestments. So right there, we learn that sidon, the shroud, could be a garment. And I'm going to suggest that if you take the instrumental understanding of that preposition through as with, when it says Jesus appeared as a high priest with the greater and more perfect tent, what could he appeared with? Well, he could have appeared with his high priestly vestment. You see, you have to understand, this becomes one of the types then of the shroud. It becomes Jesus's high priestly robe. On the Day of Atonement, there was special garments made for the high priest, and there were several characteristics about his Day of Atonement garments. They were to be made of fine linen. They were to have a special weave, and we know the Shroud of Turin has this herringbone weave. It was to reach down to the feet, as we know the shroud did. It went all the way down to the feet and over the back. It was to be consecrated, that is, made holy by having the blood of the sacrifice sprinkled upon it. And so when Jesus was ordained as a high priest, when he appeared as a high priest, how could that happen in Judaism without him wearing the proper garment? Well, the shroud served as that proper garment. That is how you understand the preposition with an instrumental usage. When Christ appeared as a high priest with his priestly vestment, that's the tent, you see. Now, the same verb is used for John the Baptist in the Gospel of Matthew. It says, when he appeared preaching the gospel, and it speaks of him wearing this camel hair garment, and he had a leather belt around his waist, the same verb when he begins his ministry. Well, so when Jesus is ordained, when he appears as a high priest, how can a high priest be ordained and appear on Yom Kippur to make the most important offering of the year and not be dressed in a high priestly garment? Well, that's what the shroud served as. Another thing about the Day of Atonement high priestly garment, as it shows here, he had this what's it called there's a sash around his waist, and there was a turban on his head. And it's interesting that the shroud goes all the way over the head. And then you've got this side piece that's been sewn on the side that may have served like a sash, a belt. I think it's just so fascinating to me. But I'm going to suggest that one of the ways this was understood as a type, the shroud of the tabernacle, is he was as a high priest. It served as his priestly garment. Now, one thing we have to be, people have to understand, I was interviewed once by Dale Glover, and we had a very esteemed scholar there, and we talked for a moment about this passage, and he said that the tent and the sanctuary were the same. Well, I would suggest you can't pass through something and then the next verse say, now you're entering it. Once you pass through something, you can't then enter it. Okay? It's very important to understand that the tent that he passed through is different from the sanctuary that he then enters in verse 12. And this fits the typology of verses 2 and 3. There's two compartments in the tabernacle. There's the holy place, and there's the most holy place. And we're going to what I'm suggesting is that the shroud, as it covered and was the place of abode for the Lord for 3 days in the tomb, it served as the first compartment. And it's the tomb that serves as an earthly, most holy place. And it says in verse 1 of the text that even the first covenant had an earthly sanctuary. Well, guess what? The new covenant did too. And that's a lot of what we're trying to say. He throughout this passage, both before and after it, it's bracketed by the new covenant. He's talking about now as a new covenant, we have a greater high priest, and it too had types that fulfilled the antitypes of the old covenant. So this tent, greater, more perfect tent, it's known to the mature believers. It's revered with all the greater. It's the greater and more perfect. It's interesting that the writer would describe the tent this way and yet say nothing about the sanctuary. He just says he enters the sanctuary. He puts more emphasis on the first compartment, the holy place, the tent of verse 11, than he does on the heavenly sanctuary in verse 12. I think that's kind of interesting. You know, his attention's on this greater, more perfect tent, not made by human hands and not of this creation. And then yet, but he just says sanctuary. So I think that's, but so people just need to understand though that there's two compartments. They're not the same. You cannot enter. You can't pass through something and then be spoken of as then entering it. You can't pass through that which you can't enter. Let's see, that which you just passed through.
Right.
Okay, so we'll go on here. So there's two ways you can understand this preposition dia, through. You could translate how most English versions will take it this way. When Christ appeared as a high priest, he passed. Now you have to add the verb for this preposition if you use it in a locative sense, through. Through a place he passed. He passed, and the place is the greater and more perfect tent. And the tent here not only is a compartment, but it has a common wall with the second compartment. That is the holy place and the most holy place. They share a common wall. That's called the curtain. Okay? And on this side of the curtain, it's an earthly curtain, but on that side of the curtain, it's a heavenly curtain. Philo says when you pass through it, you leave the material world and you enter the immaterial. You enter the heavenly realm. Okay, so this is how one way to understand it is through the greater tent. But the other way to understand it is in an instrumental sense. When Christ appeared as a high priest with, or by means of the greater and more perfect tent, he entered the heavenly sanctuary. And here, if you take it this way, I'm saying, okay, then it's his vestment. It's his priestly robe. Because a Jew would say, well, how could he be a high priest without having the proper priestly garment, the linen robe, which all had the basic pieces here. But on the Day of Atonement, what's interesting is Aaron, on the Day of Atonement, he left all that glitter behind. The breastplate, the linen girdle, the ephod, all of that was left behind, and instead you had the white linen tunic, the robe, the sash, and the turban. And so looking something like this here. And so I think the shroud makes a very good type of this as he enters the most holy way. So here's the typological truths here concerning the priestly garment. It's made of linen, has a distinct weave, herringbone weave, as the shroud does. At the ordination, the priestly garments are consecrated with blood sprinkled from the offering on the altar. And of course, the shroud has the blood of the offering on it. It reached down to the feet. There was the white turban and the linen sash. These linen garments were worn only once, and they were left behind in the tabernacle. They weren't worthy to enter back into the earthly realm. And it's the clothing of heavenly beings, not of this creation. When you go to the book of Revelation, well, the transfiguration, he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became white as light, like a heavenly robe. In Revelation, the seven angels came out of the temple clothed in linen, clean and bright. All who were victorious, all who are victorious will be clothed in white. I will never erase their names from the book of life, but I will announce before my Father his angels, and they are mine. Then a white
Hey,
robe was given to each of them. My thesis is that each of these pieces of furniture of the tabernacle in the wilderness, this
yeah,
mobile sacred tent, were antitypes, found their fulfillment in the shroud. And of the new covenant, just as the tablets of law written by God's own hand, so this has that divine inscription, the Poetos image upon it. And like the jar of manna, the shroud wrapped the bread of life. It's the bread from heaven. And like Aaron's rod, which had a visual demonstration of life from death and vindicated his priestly authority, so the shroud with its image has that resurrection imprint, a divine image, and vindicates Christ's high priesthood. He was rejected by the people.
God's writing on the tablets, and then Christ's image being imprinted, because it's not the stone tablet, it's not the stone
Yeah.
that's been created, by God. It's the writing that was created by God, and on the shroud, it's not the linen that was created by God. It's the imprint that was created, and that's a really great simile, and I just find that fascinating.
Thank you. I find it fascinating too. And I think that's exactly the correct interpretation as we look at typology. Those two explanations, not made by human hands, that is not of this creation. That phrase, that is, means that the second explanatory clause is explaining the first. And so if the first is about the image, which I think it is, not made by human hands, so is the second, because it says that is not of this creation. It's a divine image.
Mm,
As and John, I don't know, maybe we went over First John chapter 5 where he talks about the divine witness that God testified concerning his son. First John 5 verse 9 and 10. Twice he mentions a divine testimony that God testified. And it's saying the same thing. The image is a divine witness regarding Christ Jesus, his priesthood, and his death, burial, and resurrection. All
right.
right, so to finish this, then the veil is the boundary between earth and heaven, and the shroud is the threshold of resurrection as he went through the veil, went through the curtain. The tent is a sacred dwelling of God. The shroud was the holy place of the new covenant, the sacred place of God, 3 days in the tomb. The priestly garment is fine linen. It has a patterned weave. It was consecrated by blood. Well, so does the high priestly garment of the shroud for our Lord as he appeared as a high priest. Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so let's break it there. We'll pick this up again, and then we'll try and get it so that these two sessions then will be published at about the same time. And this has
Okay.
just been fantastic. And I've got
Yeah.
so many questions for you when we get to the
Okay.
next session.
Okay.
I didn't want to interrupt you there, but you've got some really good stuff, and I wanted to make sure that I
Well,
heard everything. So that was fantastic.
thank you for the opportunity to share it. Yeah, I'm excited about it. I love to share it.
Yeah,
Thank
when
you.
do you think your book might be coming out?
Oh boy, it takes me longer than I think. I'm hoping by the end of the year. I'm hoping. So I don't know.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a book I'm doing as well on the Mandylion, and I keep saying that for the last year, I'm a month away from being done. So,
Yeah, I know. I can feel with you. I I know what you mean. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, thank you.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Larry. Well, let's cut it
Okay.
there, and we will
Yeah.
be back for certain and go from there. All right. So this is Guy Powell and the backstory on the Shroud of Turin, and definitely stay tuned for the next version or the next installment of this with Larry Stalley, and then we'll pick it up from there. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah. Thank you, Guy. Pleasure to be with you.